Nigel Farage is currently at the Reform Party conference. Will he be the next Prime Minister?
As it stands, yes, but there is a long way to go. And having observed Farage a few days earlier when he was in Washington, D.C. for the launch of GB News America, and there are quite a few obstacles I can see. I found myself standing in a crowded room thinking about this question of from here to the next election in Britain, which could well be 2029. There's a long way to go, and a great deal of work will need to be done to prepare for the day after, because winning is one kind of challenge, but the real challenge is going to be in government.
Do you think that he has professionalised the party? There's a lot of criticism over the years that he's got people around him who aren't necessarily ready for government.
I think he has professionalised the art of being Nigel Farage. I think it's a mistake to assume, as some people do, that he is just a performer, pulling a routine in the way of someone like, say, Boris Johnson, who I do think is a performer in that way. I think Nigel Farage is an authentic politician in an age when politicians are generally fraudulent, if not deeply inauthentic. But there is a real problem, an absence of organisation, and unfortunately, real politics depends upon institutional change, programs, organising a party, putting together a list. How he's going to go from being effectively a one-man band to a party which on current polling would have 400 seats. That means finding at least 400 plausible candidates, preferably without a dodgy social media past or just asking questions about the Nazis or all the other things which weirdly enough always seem to pop up whenever a new right party attempts to professionalise itself. That requires a level of professionalism that, to be honest, we've not seen. Nigel Farage's appeal is that he has run against the professionals at all time. What we've seen in the United States is something different. Donald Trump also a very authentic performer in an age of inauthentic performance. On the other hand, he has actually managed, or the people around him have managed, to professionalize and institutionalize the populist movement that he led. And that is something which has eluded Nigel Farage so far. We saw it after 2016, when the Brexit referendum delivered what should have been a political order to Westminster, and Westminster did its best to reject the order and thwart it, and Farage had no institutional foundation, no party presence with which to force things on track for at least 3 years.
You talked about the United States. Obviously, Trump in his first term struggled with the professionalization, right? I mean, he appointed a lot of people who leaked against him. There was a lot of chaos in the White House, particularly the appearance of his first term was very bad. Second term, there's been a bit of a change, so maybe Nigel needs to jump straight to the second term.
Yes, and I think this is true, and when we were in DC, we did hear a prominent member of the administration was telling us that this is a totally different feel, that there are not people briefing against the administration from inside the tent. The blob, the official Washington, underestimated Trump in the first term, but nevertheless was able to sort of bounce him off, and they made the mistake of assuming he wouldn't come back. And when they did come back, of course, the second time around, they had a whole off-the-shelf, fully prepared from day one plan for the aggressive transformation and takeover of the system. And that is what's required if you want to force real institutional change, if you want to change how government works. And populism, as we know, is a mood. It's a mood of disgust and outrage, a feeling that government has broken the unspoken contract that it has with its people. Well, you have to channel that outrage in order to win an election, but you have to have a very sober institutional program to get it into the institutions or through the government, and for it then all to cycle back into society. I do get the impression in Britain that there are a lot of people, individuals, small groups, who are very aware of this challenge, because it is not rocket science in a way. We know how it works, and a first past the post system actually can intensify your impact if you have the program in hand when you get there. People assumed on the right in Britain that they had until 2029. The speed with which Labour government has effectively lost all control over British politics and the institutions it claims to be governing, indicate that it's possible that the election could come forward. And I'm increasingly concerned that an incoherent, divided, feuding right is going to be unable to organise itself. And you may well see a kind of minority Labour government with a Lib Dem coalition or some nightmare scenario, for me anyway, a nightmare heaven if you live in, I don't know, North Oxford or somewhere like that. But that kind of scenario is not impossible at the moment. We could, and I do believe that would mark Britain going over the cliff, actually. If we have another 9 years of the mismanagement and effectively failure that we've seen over the last year, compounding everything that has happened since 2008, gross economic mismanagement, and the deliberate mismanagement of immigration policy is the only way to call it. All of these things, I think, it would be a point of no return, actually. Britain would slip out of the top 10 global rankings. It would become a Portugal with lousy weather. And I don't believe that's something that the people of Britain are prepared to accept. And that's one reason why there is effectively a standoff now between the government and its people. And that kind of standoff is a bad and dangerous thing because you know where it leads. It leads to confrontation and breakdown. And these things need to be avoided. And therefore, it's in the national interest, not just in the interest of the actors involved or the parties or whoever, I might like to see winning. It is in the national interest that there is a coherent opposition with a coherent plan so that when the people vote them in, you will have a rotation of power and that politics, as in the management of bureaucratic government and law, politics will then move forward. If you don't have that, you just have a recipe for further instability. Imagine a scenario where Reform put up their 400 candidates and they come out as the larger party in the coalition with the Conservatives, which on present polling would seem to be the likely scenario. I find it very hard to believe that those kind of candidates, totally inexperienced randos, really, who just fancied a shot at it, would know how to run a ministry. They would be run by their ministries. They would be in the yes minister scenario. And I don't imagine that government would stand for very long. What would happen, I suspect, is that Reform would collapse and their voters would fall back into the Conservatives, who, by forming that coalition, would pretty much have ended up in Reform's lane, which is, after all, where Robert Jenrick has already moved.
This kind of malaise of incompetency has plagued governments for decades in Britain. I mean, you could go back a long way, even perhaps since the end of the Second World War. And even Thatcher, she struggled to control the government that she led.
Yeah.
I mean, that's where Yes Minister really came from. So there's this sort of idea that we used to have this competency and we've lost it in recent years. Starmer came in last year with Labour thinking that with the good guys, with the sensibles, we'll sort everything out. Now that it's us in charge, everything will be fine. And obviously, reality has caught up to them.
It certainly has.
So Farage really faces a huge challenge that previous governments, Labour and Tory, have both failed. How is he going to stand up against this?
This is a really good point. I mean, people have said, and I think it's true, that Starmer has lawyer brain, which is a condition into which people are trained. I think it's also one maybe people are born lawyers, but also it's one that they learn, that we live in a peaceful, stable society of rational processes in which conflicts is competition rather than actual conflict, and therefore can be managed by trade-offs and limits and all of the stuff, the safetyist culture that we are habituated to. We don't even see it most of the time. We're so habituated to it. And obviously that's not the reality that Starmer and his government are presented with, and therefore the levers of power don't seem to move when they pull at them. And there is, as you said, a long-term personnel problem in that, as you know, when you meet MPs, and you probably had to deal with even more of them than I have, most of them are stupid and self-serving, and often the best of them have a sense of what their responsibilities are to their electors locally, but have no real grasp of what it is to be a national politician. There's a serious problem of quality, basically. They're not sending their best. I mean, they're really not. They're not even sending their best lawyers, frankly, because there are far better remunerations that you can get and remain a private citizen without having people throwing eggs and milkshakes at you and going through your receipts over how many homes you've got. You can just have a
and no one wants to pay politicians, you know.
No, and I've written about this. I've actually found myself arguing by the final paragraph that they actually need to give them a raise. Despite the fact they're incompetent and self-serving, you're not going to attract better people to it unless you're paid as well as, or at least competitively, with being a lawyer in a private practice or in the city or something like that.
This is what they do in Singapore.
Yeah.
And the argument in favour of it is that it stops corruption.
Yeah, well, they have very strong anti-corruption laws in Britain and Singapore. And in Britain, we have laws against it, and they're simply not enforced. Everybody knows that the political class is susceptible to a brown envelope. This has been proven in all parties over a number of years. And again, it's impressive how petty the amounts are. And how small that.
Well, just look at the expenses scandal. You know, that's one great example of that. And there's all this kind of soft corruption that we see around politics because they're not paid enough.
Yeah, exactly. And no one wants to be the poorest guy at the table of rich people, which in effect you will be if you're an MP with a bunch of businessmen, or let alone foreign potentates. So it's true, Nigel Farage, or the next Prime Minister, will face a challenge which I think is unprecedented since 1945. And at least in 1945, there was a high degree of consensus, briefly, about what kind of society was going to be reconstructed. The whole idea that Britain had to be a home for heroes with a social democratic, welfare state, replacing the kind of patchwork, and also the aristocracy displaced, literally, from power, from its lands by taxation. That's a quiet revolution of the kind that has happened a few times in British history. And it seems that we are at that moment again. You need a managed transition, as we now say. And it's not clear to me that the plan is yet coherent. I don't think the Conservatives, who have the infrastructure to do this, they have their researchers and they have a central office and all that. The Conservative Party remains fundamentally hostile to transforming the British state because the Conservative Party has barnacled itself onto it from opposing the creation of a welfare state in 1945. Like the Republicans, it became the B team to the official party of the system. And so when people were sick of one, they could rotate in the other. The vast majority of Conservative MPs in Parliament do not want things to change. They remain the party of the Cameron-era party, and the Cameron-era party is Blairism's B team. So it's the entire post-97 state that is failing to operate anymore. And beneath that, as you're saying, is this deep failure of the post-1945 state. The whole thing has to be put on a functioning footing. Just functioning would be good. So when people talk about RNHS as the last consensus point, that shows, the NHS is, the crown jewels of that post-war welfare state. The fact that it can't be made to work, that it's usually deeply unpleasant to have any dealings with it, indicates actually how deep the state failure has got. And so we arrive at a term which is usually being used in our era to indicate a sort of a violent overthrow of a corrupt dictator, which is regime change. But actually the regime, in Aristotle's terms, in Politeia, Aristotle talks about the regime as just being the political system in its entirety, how it works. And it's very clear that if you try and take a train or try and renew a piece of documentation or try and start a company or try and do any of the things that the regime is meant to permit and encourage, that the regime is failing. And therefore, when it's failed, you need to transplant in organs and change it and so on. And there's not enough coherent planning for that, and we need to do it. Otherwise, there is no bottom. It's failure all the way down. If no Thatcher had appeared in 1979, what would have happened? The wet Tories would have committed themselves to managed decline part 2, which they'd committed themselves to after 1945, and which they committed themselves to again after 2010. Managed decline is Cameron and Osborne and Haig and all those people. I don't want to live in a failing state. I don't believe anybody except the people who are salaried by a failing state want to live in it. So it's an unacceptable, in a democracy, an unacceptable situation, and people will demand change. They will demand reform with a small r, and they may well get reform with a capital R, because that's the only credible voice, which, as I said, the only authentic performer in this whole circus is Nigel Farage, but there has to be a programme.
I know that you've written about kind of revolution and this revolt in Britain, this febrile atmosphere on the streets. I mean, you can look to the 1970s and you can make a similar argument that there was just total incompetency, riots, these strikes, complete chaos, and obviously Thatcher came in. And in the early years, Thatcher really struggled.
Yeah, it got worse before it got better.
It got worse before it got better, and then she had the Falklands, and that kind of saved her political career. I mean, Farage, maybe he needs some sort of a, what's it called, a ex machina.
Well, you never know, right? Events, dear boy, as Macmillan, Mr. Managed Decline, Macmillan famously said. Yeah, I mean, I'm just about old enough to remember the 1970s, and what I do remember is it was a very coherent society. It was divided, but there was a foundation to it. Britain was not an American style balkanized, multiracial, multi-religious society at all. The main tension in English life was between the unions and the government, which when you think about it is almost traditional. Labour unions versus the government is a 19th century kind of story. And the other big issue was the Irish Republican terrorism, which was on a very small scale. The estimate for the number of active terrorists the IRA had in their prime is somewhere between 300 and 500 or something. It was small enough to be managed and bottled up in Northern Ireland. That's not the case with Islamism in Britain. As you know that because even the security services, who like to keep things quiet, actually have effectively to appeal in public for more funding by saying we've got so many suspects, there's 40,000 of them and we can't keep up, and there's more on the back burner who might be active later that we've got tabs on. Effectively send us more money and don't blame us if one of them gets through the net. That's what those kind of public announcements mean. So Britain is divided in different ways. And also there's a factor which is people's expectations have risen. And this is something Alexis de Tocqueville wrote about when discussing the French Revolution. You know, states become weak in two ways. One of them is when people's rising expectations become thwarted. And since 2008, effectively, GDP growth in Britain and wages growth have pretty much flatlined. So that's a very clear example of what we're asking for, what Tocqueville calls effectively the revolution of rising expectations. If you don't keep the upward thing, I'm doing better than my parents and they did better than the grandparents, I have hope for my children, then people will turn on the government and they'll say to their children, leave, if you can leave. That's one thing that de Tocqueville noticed. The other thing he noticed is that when a government does admit there's a problem and starts to make concessions, it's legitimating the whole critique of the system. So when the French government was on the verge of bankruptcy in the 1780s, and they started getting in, you know, the accountants to go through the books, and they aired the books, and everyone looked at it, then, you know, the state had legitimated the critics who said that you are not capable of running, you know, a business. You're not capable of running a corner shop, let alone an autocratic monarchy with an empire attached. And that's also when Starmer says, I recognise the need for reform, or yes, I actually do have a supply of St. George's flags and I always wear my, you know, Union Jack underpants at the weekend. When he says that, he is legitimating the entire critique which says the system, in particular the Labour Party, does not care about the English or the British or their best interests. So you're into this kind of thing which leads to a breakdown, a revolutionary moment. Now in Britain, as in the United States, revolutions are not the same as in the non-Anglo systems. The British Revolution is one which occurs in a deniable manner. The basic definition of a revolution, certainly in modern times, is one that involves a critical transfer of property as well as status. So if you look at the 1945 system that came in Britain, it broke the power of the aristocracy. It did it without the guillotine. You just had to tax them. And so they were forced to turn their lovely estates over to the public and turn, you know, the East Wing into a tea shop and to, you know, and survive by living in the gatehouse. It wasn't necessary to cut their heads off. We just had to cut the wallets off, in effect. That's an example of this. And you can see a complete continuity from, you know, claimed continuity, and this counts for a lot, from Magna Carta to the development of Parliament to the Bill of Rights and the Glorious Revolution to the Reform Act to 1945, and also to the post-Thatcher settlement. Each of these involved massive transfers of property and status and brought a new class to power, but all of it was done in the name of a continuous system. And American society has developed in the same way. About every 80 years, there's a real shift over who gets to run the American system. and who it's for and how it works. You obviously have a revolution in colonial America, the Civil War, which creates one kind of system, FDR and World War II, which creates another, and now we're in that 80-year turning point as well. 2020 is pretty much where it fell, and it explains a lot of the bitterness in American politics. And what you're seeing now in the US is that the new institutions, the new shape of things is taking place in the second Trump term, and there's a lowering of the political temperature and a sense that we're heading into sort of calmer waters. And in Britain, that process was kick-started by the Brexit referendum in 2016, and it's been held off and delayed, in part because of this way that Anglo systems work. They're designed to slow down and absorb these shocks of popular opinion. They've absorbed it so well, and they've become so paralyzed by their own incompetence, which is a big factor in Britain, that they're incapable of delivering even the managed change, which if you ask people what they want, they don't want, yes, I want to execute the lanyard class, or they don't want that. They want to have mortgages that don't go up. They want to have jobs where their wages are secure and rising, and they want to have prospects for their children. In other words, they want a competent state that can manage the kind of outcomes that are not beyond reasonable expectation.
Crucially, they have had enough of immigration, and they have had enough immigration for decades. And every single government that has made a promise to cut and reduce migration has done the exact opposite. And this is a really interesting part of our democratic system. There seems to be a lack of democratic consent. There seems to be a democratic deficit in Britain. Absolutely. And by Starmer continually making these promises, we're going to deport them, we're going to smash the gangs. I love the English flags. My whole house is just an English flag, and I live in the cross. You know, and then the opposite thing happens. What happens to the democratic consent then? What happens to the public mood then? What happens to the public anger? And we've seen these riots happen. Do you think there's been a moment in British history where there's been such a disconnect between the elites and the masses? You can tell us.
There is, funnily enough.
You can tell us the English Civil War. You can tell us.
No, it's not just the English Civil War.
You can go back to many examples. I want you to.
Okay.
But so this isn't an unprecedented moment.
No, it
so
isn't.
What lessons can we learn from those past times?
Many years ago, before I got a proper job, I did a doctorate in history, and I researched the Gordon Riots of 1780. This was a point at which the American War of Independence, the American Revolution, was going very badly for Britain. It was clear they couldn't win it. They were beginning to run out of people for the top job. You know, George III was running out. Eventually, they couldn't find someone to fill the prime ministership, rather like the Conservatives in the end of their run. And at this point, there was a kind of nationalist riot, which was the biggest riot in British history, led by a man called Lord George Gordon. And we are in a similar dynamic now. Who would really want the top job now? The war is lost. You know, the war to preserve Tony Blair's kingdom is clearly lost. By public opinion has not just rejected it, it has vehemently turned against it. It is rejecting the legitimacy of the state. It's that deep, and it's boring, but it's true. The legitimacy of the state is what is at stake here. And immigration has become the key issue because it's become the most blatant issue of governments being unable to deliver on promises. And that suggests they never meant them in the first place. Because as you're saying, every elected winner since 2010 promised to reduce immigration, and yet the opposite happened. The Conservative Party bears a particular blame for this. They inherited Tony Blair's model and kept going with it when it was clear. Because, I mean, it's possible to overestimate how great the 90s were. They were fine. But in retrospect, they've taken on this rosy hue because people weren't having their throats cut and things weren't falling apart. But the Conservatives inherited this and kept going with it long after the public had realized actually the 90s aren't that great and we'd like to go back to how things were before. This is a consistently foolish and damaging thing. And the fact also that mass immigration has become closely associated with Islamist terrorism, a general sectarianism, and in particular, the mass grooming and rape of English working class girls by mostly Pakistani and Bangladeshi Muslim men. This is organized crime, by the way. It is not individual acts. This is an organized criminal enterprise which has overlapped, as we know, with drug dealing and all, visa fraud, forced marriage, a whole range of things. All of this has deeply undermined the legitimacy of the state in the eyes of the average man or woman in the street. It's an extraordinary achievement to have trashed the stability for which Britain was so world famous. And the breaking down of that stability has then forced the government, and both parties again have done this, forced the government to adopt ever more heavy-handed methods to try, in its eyes, to keep things steady and keep the ship afloat. But the ship isn't moving forward, it's becalmed. There's no growth, population is going up, but wages are not, so there's a house price boom. And the whole thing just kind of becomes increasingly untenable. The one thing it has is the stick to beat down perfectly legitimate expressions of unhappiness and dissatisfaction, which is why free speech has then become, there's this cascading thing from immigration to Islamism and the problem of Britain's Islamic communities, large numbers of whom clearly hate everything that in the society they're in and are actively hostile to it, to free speech becoming the great issue because people have had enough. It is possible still to express yourself legally in Britain and say how dissatisfied you are, but it's very clear, and the randomness of prosecution seems almost designed to encourage people to internalize this. It's very clear that you could be randomly prosecuted and have your life ruined.
Following the Gordon riots, we had an unprecedented period of good governance by William Pitt the Younger.
Yes.
Obviously, we had the Napoleonic Wars.
I'm glad to see you've been reading. You may be the only person who actually read my doctoral thesis, Steve, I think. Thank you.
Well, I love that period of history, British history. I mean, we're winners. That's when we're winning.
Yeah,
right?
it's the golden age.
And then we have 100 years of British global dominance. So maybe Nigel Farage is William Pitt the Younger, or maybe he's the elder, I don't know. But we'll have to leave it there. Maybe you can comment on that very briefly.
I'm going to comment very. I once asked Nigel Farage about this. You know, who do you see yourself, you know, in history? And he said John Wilkes, who was the leader of the London merchants against the corrupt court, against Westminster in his day. So that I think is a very good parallel. The Gordon riots were a disaster, and they became a license for massive suppression. Yes, Pitt did very well, and he brought in what was called the Conservative Restoration. And one of the things that went under in the 1790s, in part also because of the French Revolution, which kind of confirmed what Edmund Burke was warning about. And he was, incidentally, was one of the collateral victims of the rioters in 1780. Free speech took a serious knocking, and income tax came in and went up during the Napoleonic Wars. So, you know, be careful what you wish for is always the message from history. But the other message you've got to find in this is, when things are as bad as they are now, you know, you should probably change before, you know, the roof comes in. There's a famous story about the Duke of Wellington, who was Mr. Conservative Restoration, you know, in the 19th century. People saying to him, you know, we can't go on like this, my lord, you know, things have got to change, we need reform. And he said, reform, aren't things bad enough already? At a moment like that, you know, you need reform, capital R or not, and we are where we are, and it's very important that, you know, people of goodwill, as we like to say, pull together and come up with a plan to fix it, because I don't want to live in a failed and violent state, and I don't believe most people do.
Maybe not Farage, maybe Starmer will become the Iron Duke with the iron shutters, because all of these stones are being thrown through his windows. Anyway.
That was an observation, that was not incitement, I just want to make that clear.
We're just joking. 19th century jokes. Thank you so much, Dominic, for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Steve.